Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here and to talk to you about the work I've been doing. So when Rachel contacted me asking if I would be interested in giving a talk to you, that was about a month and a half ago. I was still in the US, where I spent the past year as a visiting research scholar at Princeton University. And that's probably a good point to start this presentation. So I was there in Princeton to do some research in the frontier of physics and diplomacy, basically. And I am a diplomat, a career serving Brazilian diplomat, and I happen to have a PhD in nuclear physics from Manchester University there in the UK. I met Rachel when I was doing my postdoc in Canada and Triumph. I think Rachel was doing her master's at the time. That was back in 2009, so it's been 11 years now.
It was a bit later than that, actually. I think because I moved to Canada in 2011.
So
yeah, so it's
okay, yeah, because I arrived in Canada in 2009 and I left in 2012, so we overlapped there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
So at the time, I didn't know I was going to end up as a diplomat. I was still thinking about pursuing a career in science, and many things, changed radically since those days. So I will probably today talk how I transitioned from science to diplomacy, and the work I've been doing in the frontier of science and diplomacy. And Rachel, she said that you have an interest in talking about nuclear disarmament. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I would like this to be more interactive. So if you have any questions, please let me know. So basically, I left then Triumph in 2012 in Canada, back to Brazil, and I spent 2 years here in Brazil studying to pass our national diplomatic entry exam. So in order to become a diplomat here in Brazil, we all have to take this exam. It's very comprehensive. Subjects very different from what I was used to studying. So I had to really sit down and learn about international relations, international law, a lot of political science and history, economics, trade, geopolitics. So during these 2 years, I was studying for this exam. I received a grant, a scholarship to do that. So I was a fellow of the Brazilian Ministry of External Relations during these years. So I was taking some classes, self-learning, reading many books, and so during these 2 years, I was getting ready for this exam. And then in 2014, I passed this exam nationwide. I was fourth place out of about 6,000 applicants. So that was very, very good. And
so is that applicants just from Brazil, or is that people
from Brazil? From Brazil. So a prerequisite to become a Brazilian diplomat is to be a natural-born Brazilian citizen. Some countries, I think, they allow people from other nationalities. When you become a citizen of another country, you may also be able to join the diplomatic corps. But in Brazil, we do need to be a natural-born Brazilian citizen, or either of your parents must be a Brazilian citizen. Which is my case. My mother, she's Brazilian, but my father, he is not. My father, he's from Africa. He's from Guinea-Bissau. And then he went to Brazil in the 70s, and then he stayed in Brazil. But he met my mother in Brazil. I was born in Brazil. So I was born in Brazil, and one of my parents is Brazilian. So I'm a Brazilian citizen, and therefore I was eligible to apply. And so, as I said, I passed this exam. But this was quite a challenge because, as I said, the subjects that you have to study for this exam is not something that the physicist is usually trained to do. So
what made you want to do it?
Yeah, that's the thing. I was trying to pursue a career in physics. I was doing my first postdoc, and when I was coming to the end of my contract with the lab, I was trying to find options, to continue in physics. I even received an offer to go to another lab in the US, which turned out not to happen. And then I learned about this opportunity to apply for this fellowship first, to receive a grant, and for people from all walks of life if they want to become a diplomat. And this fellowship was targeted for Black Brazilians. So there is also another element there that I would like to add, because in Brazil, although more than half of our population is Black or mixed with Blacks, we don't have many Blacks in our foreign service, and they've realized that, and they've wanted to change that. So this program was a way to make this happen, and I received this grant, and I passed this exam. But still, I was part of a class of 18 people, and plus one, there was another guy coming from another class. But I was the only Black person still, So even after these affirmative action programs, the total number of Black diplomats in Brazil is less than 5%. And so we are like 1,600 people in total, out of which 50 are Black. So still is a low number, but things are changing, and so I was also attracted by the possibility of representing Brazil abroad, and negotiating on behalf of Brazil, and all this all these things that diplomats do on behalf of their countries. You represent, you negotiate, you keep your country informed of what is happening abroad, and you also serve the nationals that are living abroad through all the consular networks that your country has abroad. So I think people, they have been asking me this question about how and why I decided to change careers. This is a very difficult question to answer, because it's very subjective. I could have, if I wanted to, stayed in academia for a little while. I could have even tried to have an academic career back in Brazil, to become, I don't know, a lecturer, a professor here in Brazil. But there was something that told me that I needed to make a change. I had to listen to my internal voice telling me that I was ready for something else. You know?
I think as well, because as a postdoc, you've spent so long studying as well, right? So could you just, I don't know if the girls know how long it takes to get to the position you were as a postdoc. Could you just briefly say how long you spent studying before you got to this point?
Yeah.
Just put it in perspective.
I mean, in physics, so basically I had an undergrad in physics. I had a bachelor's degree. And during my bachelor's, which was like a 4-year program, I spent 1 year abroad as an exchange student in the UK. I was in Manchester. That's how that's how I ended up, later on doing my PhD, because I
Yeah,
met Professor Billows there.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how I ended up in Canada as well, right? My degree
Yeah.
included a summer studying in Canada, and then that's once I finished my degree and masters in the UK, I then went over to Canada
Hmm.
and did more
Yeah.
studying over there, back where I was as part of that exchange program.
Yeah, so these things, I think they're really
Mm,
transformational, because I had no exposure to the international life. I had never left Brazil. So this first time I left the country when I was still an undergrad really made a radical change.
wow.
Living with people from different countries, and then when I decided to go back to the UK the year after I finished my degree to do my PhD there, the PhD program was in Switzerland at CERN. Um, and there I spent doing my field work there at CERN almost 2 years. And as you know, it's a very international place as well. So in a way, I was kind of doing scientific diplomacy
Wow, yeah.
for many years, and I was exposed to all these, opportunities to engage with people from different parts of the world. So I think this somehow also partly explains why I decided to stay in diplomacy, and perhaps maybe amplify the training I've received, from the technical side, and try to bring this into a broader political discussion about science and society, and so on.
Absolutely. I don't
You
know.
see what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know what you think about the politicians in Brazil, but I certainly think the politicians in this country in some cases, could do with having more specialists, more scientists involved in politics and decision making.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is a problem everywhere. I think even now with this pandemic, we see the importance of evidence-based policy, and science, driven policy, because at the end of the day, this really saves lives. And so we have an intense discussion happening everywhere, including here in Brazil, about the need of having experts, and to respect the words of experts when they're talking about their subjects in which they've spent so many years studying. And you cannot compare the words of an expert with an opinion of someone who spent 5 minutes in Google, trying to argue about something that is very important. So we have that problem nowadays, but I think that the best way to tackle this issue is really for society itself to decide what kind of representation they want to have in parliament, in other spheres of decision making, and when you vote, you have the power to decide who you want to be representing you, and I think that there are two things that contribute to this issue. One is that some scientists, they do not engage at all with policy making, and I think that's an error. That's a mistake. You cannot be sort of isolated from the world, doing just your science, pure science. It's important, but this needs to be connected somehow with society.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, unfortunately, we do not have many scientists who decide to enter politics, and even run for office, or for some positions in the government. I think we would need more of those, because we are in the 21st century. We talk a lot about knowledge societies, and so the problems that we have to tackle are very complex, and we need people who know what they're talking about to help society to survive
Absolutely.
in times of difficulty like this one.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I think so, a lot of the time, people want a simple answer, a black and white kind of statement, and it requires people who have had training in looking at complex arguments to really get to the root of things, and that's one of the values of having a scientific background and then going into different positions.
Exactly. So, and in terms of training, just to finish answering the question you asked about the time it takes. So typically you spend 3 to 4 years doing your bachelor's degree. Then there's an extra 3 to 4 years of doing a PhD. Some people do a master's in between, and the master's can last 1 to 2 years. And then there's a postdoc, and postdocs, they can typically last 1, 2, or 3 years. And so in total, we are talking about at least 10 years of scientific training. And that's the time I spent anyways in physics. And so, as I said, after leaving physics, then I spent 2 extra years getting somehow retrained to become a diplomat. So first I had to sit down and study the subjects for the entrance exam, for the Foreign Service exam. And when I passed, there was an extra 1.5 years of training into diplomacy. And then I was assigned my first position, and I was working with the information systems of our ministry. It's interesting because I have also a technical degree in programming. So I was partially responsible for the development of the new systems for communications in our ministry. So this involved a little bit of cryptography, a little bit of network security, and so on.
Oh wow! So you have 2 degrees, one in physics and one in programming.
Yeah, the programming degree is a technical degree. So it's not like an undergrad bachelor's level, but that's my first training, because I studied in a technical school. So my high school was combined with this technical training in programming.
Oh,
so
wow.
and this is interesting because these skills of programming really followed me throughout my entire career. During my PhD, all my data analysis, all my data, I had to write my own code to analyze, and because of the skills I acquired years before, that was really facilitating my life. And so during my PhD and then during my postdoc as well. And so I finally, when I entered this foreign service and I start my first job, I have to deal with some of these issues again. So this is something interesting, and we have this particular feature of our diplomatic service in Brazil, which is that we are trained to do many things. So although we specialize at some areas during our career, but we are supposed to be able to work in different parts of our foreign service. So and so because I had this training and an interest in this issue, so I started working there. And then after less than a year, I was transferred to the Office of Disarmament issues. And probably that's where I would like to spend the rest of this presentation to talk about. We were working with issues related to disarmament and non-proliferation, and the export control of dual-use items. So there's a lot to unpack here. So I will start probably with disarmament and what that means. Basically, we have the weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons. So multilaterally, at the United Nations level and its specialized agencies, diplomats, on behalf of their countries, they've been over, decades trying to negotiate treaties to eliminate all these weapons of mass destruction, right? Because they cause unnecessary harm and unnecessary suffering, and they cannot distinguish between a soldier and a civilian. So these weapons are inherently inhumane, not compatible at all with the rules of engagement in the battlefield. So when you deploy any weapon system in a war situation, international law, international humanitarian law dictates that these weapons, they need to be able to differentiate between the innocent and those that are considered the soldiers of countries. So because these weapons do not have these characteristics, they are considered to be incompatible. And so the first one of these weapons to be abolished were the biological weapons, and then what followed was the prohibition of the chemical weapons, and our last challenge is to try to eliminate the nuclear weapons. And this one is a very difficult one, but the international community has been making tremendous progress over the last 5 years, say. So that's one part of my work. I was involved mainly on these talks and negotiations for the abolition of nuclear weapons, also the control of dual-use items. So these dual-use items, these are those that can be used either for peaceful purposes and for weapons productions, basically. So if you talk about nuclear technology, if you take some of the components of a nuclear reactor, some of these things, they can be converted for the production of weapons material for a nuclear warhead. So when countries are trading these items, there is an extra layer of checking if the countries that are going to receive, that are on the receiving end of this trade, if they're going to comply with certain rules, if they're going to commit to only use those items for peaceful purposes, and so on. And so it's a very complex subject, and I spent some years also dealing with those issues. And then you go into the detail of what needs to be controlled and what parameters need to be controlled for those items. So things that you may not even believe that is of interest, but vacuum pumps, for example. Vacuum pumps are export controlled items because they can be used for the enrichment of uranium for, the production of a nuclear warhead. And so whenever a country is trying to sell vacuum pumps, depending on the configuration of these pumps, on the technical specifications of the pumps, you have to apply certain rules to ensure that this trade is going to be as safe as possible. And
I had no idea about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like
so,
hermetically sealed ones in particular.
Exactly. And so and things are getting really complicated as well, because this control is not only applicable to the physical goods as such, but also to the intangible knowledge. So people talk now a lot about knowledge transfer. And so even if someone sits down at a lecture on nuclear fission, for instance, depending on the intentions of this person, one could say that if the professor is not careful, if the university is not careful enough, they may be accused of contributing to the proliferation of a knowledge that can be used for the construction of a nuclear artifact. So things are getting really difficult to control these days. And so I've been involved with some of these discussions. And of course, one of the difficulties that we face is that these weapons, the nuclear weapons, they exist. They are in the hands of a few countries. Some of them are signatories of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that was negotiated in the late 60s. And so basically, according to this treaty, there are 5 nuclear weapon states: the United States, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, the UK, France, and China. Right, and so while on the one hand this treaty recognizes that these countries are nuclear weapon states, on the other hand, the treaty also calls upon these countries to take measures that would lead the world for nuclear weapons free status. So these countries should also undertake negotiations to eliminate their arsenals. And so this is something that has been very slow since the 60s, 70s. We haven't seen the elimination of these weapons, and nowadays we hear countries talking about modernizing their arsenals. Like the US, they have a plan to spend about $1 trillion over the next decades to modernize their weapons. They're now talking about reducing the yield of these weapons so that they could even deploy them. So it's a very difficult time that we live in. The security environment is difficult, and in the midst of that, the majority of the countries do not have nuclear weapons, and they've decided to sit down once again and to negotiate a treaty to try and eliminate these weapons once and for all, or at least making a significant step towards its elimination by making it illegal. As I said, according to international humanitarian law, nuclear weapons would cause so much damage to civilians and to civilian infrastructure that there is no hypothesis in which the use of these weapons could be seen to be in conformity with the rules of engagement of any armed conflict. And so we are trying to establish now an understanding in the international community that would make these weapons illegal. If any country ever decides to use it against each other, that this would be illegal. Just one second. Okay, that's my son that's doing something there.
Is he okay? Do you need to check on him or anything?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. So I've been involved with that, and in 2018, I was chosen as a fellow of the United Nations Disarmament Program. This is a program that was founded in the 70s. And the disarmament fellows, they spend 3 months with the United Nations as interns of the United Nations, and you have the opportunity to visit all the multilateral organizations that deal with disarmament issues. So I had the privilege to be one of these fellows, and we also visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was something very special. When you see on the ground the effect of a nuclear warhead explosion, and you see the images, you talk to the people, you talk to the survivors. We had a session to talk with people who were like very young at the time, but they still have vivid memories about those days. And then you understand the humanitarian approach that needs to be considered when we talk about these weapons. There is another thing that I was also involved. We're talking a lot about the new technologies of war. So we're talking about cyber warfare. We're talking about the use of drones, the use of artificial intelligence in the battlefield, and how to regulate that. So I've also been involved in some of these discussions. At the moment, for instance, there is a very difficult negotiation taking place at the United Nations to decide how we will deal with the problem of artificial intelligence in the battlefield. We're talking about the autonomous weapon systems. And so these would be basically killer robots. And the question is such a robot, is it lawful to use such weapons in the battlefield? Can this weapon decide for itself about the life and death of humans without human intervention? Is that lawful to use that? And in case there is a mistake, in case there is a problem, who is going to be responsible? Is it going to be the commander? Is it going to be the systems engineer? Is it going to be the programmer? Who is going to respond for mistakes in the deployment of these weapons? And so there is a very difficult discussion happening right now. Some countries, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was literally just writing down as a question, like, who would be responsible for that? What are the thoughts on that at the moment? Is it going on? Like, is there sort of one thought on that, or is it just still completely open?
It depends. It depends on who you ask, because one of the most difficult things in multilateral diplomacy is to reach consensus. Yeah. We're talking about almost 200 countries, right? Sure. And countries with very different resources, different interests as well, and militarily primarily.
Yeah. So, some countries just couldn't build such a thing anyway, right?
They couldn't anyway, and they are very afraid, because if they couldn't and some other countries could, one could imagine a scenario in which a very weak country would be completely dominated by another country that would just throw a swarm of robots to take their territory, for example.
Yeah.
So that is something that is an issue. On the other hand, there is an arms race happening, because if there is no regulation and there is one country with resources to go ahead in the development, in the research in that direction, any other country that is a competitor and equally capable of doing that will not stay behind.
Yeah.
So you have an arms race taking place, and you do have a handful of countries that are sort of like leading the research in this area, and we're trying to sit down and discuss with all parties involved what parameters are acceptable in this discussion. And so there is one consensus, a very broad one, which is that one cannot delegate the decision about life and death to a machine. So but the problem is that from this consensus to making this really practical in the field is going to be very difficult, because even if you put a human being behind the decision, situations can be very complicated in the battlefield. You can be swarmed with information. You have to make a decision very quickly. You can be induced to error as well. And so the interaction between the human and the machine in the battlefield, even under these circumstances, will be very difficult to disentangle.
Yeah.
So we are talking a lot about human-machine interaction in the battlefield. We're talking about algorithms and how to train them properly in order to make the correct distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant, and to feed this information to a commander who will have to make the final call. But it's going to be very difficult. So there is one part of countries, of the international community, that they just want an outright ban on these weapons. that would be like a radical approach, saying that that's not where we want to go. It's best to just ban them, and some countries they've subscribed to this view, but it's going to be very difficult to convince other countries that have a more flexible view on this subject. And maybe I should also mention that there is a precedent about banning a system even before it's being fully developed. In the late 80s, there was an intense discussion at the United Nations to ban laser weapon systems that could blind people, right? And at the time, the discussion was basically centered around the idea that these lasers would harm people in an unnecessary way, would cause unnecessary suffering, would basically make people blind permanently with no direct military gain, right? It's just like it's like a landmine, you know. A landmine is designed to amputate someone. It's not designed to take someone's life, but by amputating someone, mutilating someone, you're just creating a problem for the rest of that person's life and for the rest of the life of the community around that person. A problem for their family, a problem for for the country. So for this reason, landmines were abolished. So we were also discussing this for the laser weapon systems. They were still in their infancy. So, but it was possible to come to an agreement, and they were banned. And they were banned. You don't see laser weapon systems anywhere. And it's interesting because at the time, some commanders, some people from the military, they said that these weapons would be perfectly fine because they don't kill. They just make someone blind, and that's not a problem. So you see, that's how we evolve our understanding and how we go from seeing something that this is the least of the evils to something that is inhumane, and therefore we shouldn't even go there. So
yeah, it's interesting that weapons that, as you say, mutilate or maim but don't kill are banned, but then weapons that kill are allowed. Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, this has to do with the way that the legal system has been built, and the way the legal system has been built, it recognizes that war is going to take place. It's basically, I would like to say that we would live in a world without war, but humans, they haven't been able to interact, with each other without the use of force, and that's very unfortunate. But recognizing that war is a fact that can take place, then we try to be pragmatic and regulate how war can be waged. And so, and the first thing that you need to do is to protect those people that are not engaged in the direct battle. So then we make a distinction between combatants and civilians. So combatants can be killed.
Yeah.
Again, they can be killed under certain circumstances during combat. If they are out of combat, they shouldn't be killed. They shouldn't be taken to a concentration camp. They shouldn't be tortured. You see what I mean? So, but if you are in combat and someone is killed, and that is considered legitimate under the framework of international humanitarian law that regulates the law of armed conflicts. But what is not allowed is to use a weapon that will destroy, say, if you have like a military target next to a church. Then that's controversial because you may blast that place and even accepting the collateral damage, but only if the military advantage, the anticipated military advantage, is is proportional to the attack. And so, but that's the ideal world. We see what is happening in many war zones, and we know that parties do not really respect many of these rules. But that's where we want to be, And actually, the final goal would be to eliminate war, systemic war, also to really confine the hypothesis in which the use of force is allowed. For example, according to the United Nations Charter, you can only wage war in self-defense. You can war for conquering other land, or for revenge or whatever is not possible. And also. This needs to be authorized by the United Nations Security Council. So you cannot unilaterally decide to wage war with your neighbor, just because you don't like him. So, and even if you have been the object of aggression, and now you're going to fight back in self-defense, even that needs to be also done according to international law. And what international law says is that this needs to be done only to the extent that you will be able to make the other party stop the aggression. You're not going to fight back to annihilate your neighbor.
So given that, what would be some examples of wars that have been waged that were started in an illegal way?
Well, you could argue. I mean, in the recent years, many of the military operations that took place in the Middle East, for instance, they have been waged according to unilateral decision of some countries. Not with the authorization of the Security Council. And then there is a legal discussion about self-defense. Some countries said that they did that in self-defense, and then you talk about preemptive self-defense. Sure. So all the doctrine about the war on terror is based on this premise about preemptive self-defense. So because your enemy is not in any particular place, but it's kind of spread out in many different places, basically the whole world becomes a theater of war, and you act in self-defense because you are trying to anticipate a terrorist that is planning to make an attack against you. So you go there and you take him down before he can make any harm. And so so that's the discussion. That's a legal discussion as well. It's very politicized. You can imagine that the international community cannot really come to an agreement about some of these issues. Yeah. So that's where I'm staying right now. I work with these issues, and I've been concentrating a lot on the technology as such, about weapons, about weapon systems, about whether they are legal or not, trying to ban the weapons of mass destruction. And right now, since I came back from the US, I've been working on another end of this discussion, which is to look at the refugees, the people who run away from war zone, and they need to be hosted, they need to be protected, taken care of. So I'm looking more and more at the human level of this discussion, which should be the most important one. Yeah.
It's we've been doing some focus on refugees this week. We've been told it's Refugee Week. I don't know who organised that, but so each day our students have been learning about different types of refugees, whether from conflict or from climate refugees and things like that. It's I don't think it's something that's talked about enough, to be honest. Something that I feel quite strongly about. I did quite a lot of volunteering when I was a student with refugees and asylum seekers in this country, and I think the situation is just kind of getting worse. with every coming year, every new like disaster in terms of war, but also the increasing number of climate disasters that we're having.
Yeah, I mean, everything is connected. We're talking about, if we're talking about human security, definitely climate change is a driver of a great concern. And we will see, in the next decades, extreme weather conditions in many parts of the world. We're already seeing, small island states, they are disappearing in the Pacific. They are just disappearing. And this will just, make all those people, they will have to find another place to live.
Yeah.
And they will need to be hosted and taken care of. So this is a difficult discussion. But of course, we also need to address not just the symptom, but the cause of the problem. So climate change, we know there is a cause attached to it. We know about carbon emissions. We know that we need to cut, to reduce, and we need to do that in a very rational way. And we need to do this in a coordinated way as well. So the same thing with the refugees on the traditional sense. What makes them leave their place? What causes the conflict? And can we address those issues? Can we try to solve the problem and try to, to find ways to create the conditions so that these people don't need to leave their homes? Because this is very traumatic, for everyone. So, so there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of discussions, and as I said, in multilateral negotiations, every country has its own interest, and you try to protect your interests. You try to advance your interests, and you need to do this against every other actor in the discussion. So it's a difficult game.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah, carry on. Questions?
I mean, I'm open to answer questions if you have. I mean, this was more like of a conversation,
Sure.
I didn't make anything very structured because things are changing so quickly that we're talking about the pandemic right now. What's the world? What's gonna be like? How is the world going to look like in the next few years because of the pandemic? Nobody really knows. Multilateral institutions are facing a crisis right now. What can we achieve by trying to solve things multilaterally these days? That's a very good question. What substantive steps can be taken? Because on the one hand, although it's difficult to find consensus in multilateral discussions, but once you do find a minimum denominator, is something that everybody's happy with, then this is very legitimate. Yeah. This is very legitimate. The problem is that sometimes in these difficult discussions, this minimum denominator is so low that you are not really attacking this, the core of the issues. You're just, scratching the surface of the problems.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the sort of thing we're seeing with like the climate change discussions, right? Like it's just the absolute bare minimum that everyone can agree to, which isn't going to get anywhere near what we need them to.
So you see the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, ladies, do we have any other questions? Okay, so Nora says that I asked all her questions. Sorry about that. Oh, she's come up with another one. She says, do you think countries will take action for climate change and help to combat it?
Some countries, they are already taking action. And now I can talk about Brazil. We have hydropower as our main source of energy for electricity generation. And,
I'm not 100% sure they know what hydropower is. Just maybe put that.
Hydropower, basically, you have, we have many rivers in Brazil, and so we build dams and use basically gravity So in any drop of water, you just use that energy to sort of move a turbine and make that into electricity. So we have a lot of that here in Brazil. We are investing in sustainable renewables. So we're talking about wind power, solar power, also biofuel. So some countries take efforts. Like in Europe, I know that there is a huge effort now to try to make the economy less carbon intensive. And but the problem also is that not only is this difficult to find the minimum bare denominator, but also to do it in a timely manner, because we don't have enough time. We're talking about changes, radical changes that will start to take place in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
So we must act now if we really want to mitigate, to avert these changes.
Yeah.
So, and this requires massive investment. We're talking about changing the way that we produce things, the way that we consume things, the way our houses are built, the way we drive, the way we move from work to home, and so this is going to be very difficult. And some countries are taking more actions than others, but I think in the end, everybody will have to come and realize that we are in this together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we've seen with the coronavirus and governments organising to mitigate the impact of it, and what has been seen in the past when there's been like the world wars and things like that, when everybody just stops and changes what they're doing in order to to really make big impact. So like factories all of a sudden making things for the war effort. We need to see things on that sort of scale, but to combat climate change. So companies that maybe were building petrol cars or whatever, switching to going into the manufacture of things that are going to help us more with the battle with climate change.
That's correct. And just to bring this home to what we have been discussing in the very beginning, this is why we need people with some scientific background to help find solutions at the policy level to solve these issues, because sometimes people don't even understand there is a problem.
Yeah.
And what we have been seeing is people denying facts and not trusting science anymore. And that's that's one of the biggest mistakes that humans are making. So we do need to engage more with people and to show the importance of science, and be engaged in the policy level as well.
Yeah, definitely, and to get involved in those complicated issues. Like you're saying with the issues with dual use technology. So they were talking about nuclear disarmament and wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons, but then a lot of people conflate nuclear weapons with nuclear power and nuclear reactors, whereas actually the investment in nuclear reactors could be really beneficial for us in terms of cutting our carbon emissions, because obviously they don't produce any carbon dioxide. But then some of that same technology, it can then therefore be used towards the nuclear weapon. So it's people need to understand that if it's controlled correctly, the limits of it and things like that. But again, it's a complicated issue. It's something that always comes up whenever I'm teaching it. Whenever we start talking about nuclear power, straight away students are asking about nuclear weapons, and I think people really do just lump it all together as one thing.
Yeah, definitely. And we have been seeing talks about this nuclear renaissance about 10 years ago, right? And there in the UK, here in Brazil, people, they have been talking about building new power plants, and in China is building many other power plants, India, and so on. And now in the Middle East as well, they have put together some plans to build power plants over there. Definitely. I think the production of nuclear energy for civilian use, I think it's perfectly legitimate. It's every country's right to decide what type of energy they want to use, and um, but as you said, this is something that needs to be in conformity with some commitments, non-proliferation commitments, and we don't want more countries with nuclear weapons than what we already have,
Yeah.
and so it's a complicated issue, but I think with trust and confidence between countries and trying to solve the problems that leads to all the security conundrums that we have, I think that's the way to go.
Absolutely.
Because although a nuclear reactor is being built for the production of energy, but certain designs and under certain circumstances could be with not with much effort converted for the production of fissile materials for building a warhead, and people need to understand that as well. And so once we have that technology, we have invented this technology, the responsibility lays upon us to be able to be responsible and not go in ways that will just create more instability in the world.
Absolutely.
You see what I mean?
Is it true? Is it thorium reactors that they can't be used for the development of fissile material? Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Thorium, it definitely can. It
Oh, okay.
definitely can, yes. But we're talking about the amounts. But in this discussion, we are talking primarily about uranium and plutonium, really.
Yeah.
So, as I say, it's a lot of responsibility. If you have that technology, there's a lot of self-containment involved, a lot, and trust, and the decision that you will stay in the path of peace and of cooperation and dialogue. So I think that's probably what I have for today.
Sure, sure. Girls, do we have any other questions? Give them a minute if they're. You can unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can type it. I don't mind. I have a couple more as well, if you guys don't. I was going to ask. First of all, ladies, if we mentioned earlier about you mentioned about going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was wondering, girls, have you learnt about Hiroshima and Nagasaki in your history lessons, or is that something you've learnt about before? Yeah, type me a little answer or unmute yourself to respond.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have, Nora? Okay, nice. Yeah. It's interesting. I thought that you've been there, Ernesto. That must have been really informative on your diplomacy work.
It was very touching. It's a life-changing moment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned about the use of chemical weapons and different things and how they're banned. In the news recently, they were talking about the use of tear gas on protesters. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, tear gas is not considered a chemical weapon.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you look at the Chemical Weapons Convention, they have a schedule. They have a list of components of molecules that are considered to be prohibited according to the convention. We're talking about toxins that basically kill people,
right.
So those that create really skin rashes and you cannot breathe, and tear gas is considered a non-lethal weapon. That's the technical name of it. And I'm not saying they're good. They're not. They're pretty nasty, but they they have been used for riot control for a long time, and basically its primary goal is to disperse a bunch of people in a certain place, but they're not meant to kill. So yeah, so and it's nothing to do with the Chemical Weapon Convention.
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Anyone got any other questions? No? Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to come speak to us today. And if the girls or anyone else watching this recording does have any questions for you, is it okay if I forward them on to you?
Well, I mean, please feel free. And it's been a pleasure. I hope you have taken some messages from my talk. And one more thing, maybe that you could look up. Maybe you have heard about the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. It's an NGO, and it's UK based. They have an office in the UK, and they won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, 2 years ago, because of their work to help, the efforts to abolish these nuclear weapons, to prohibit them, to make them illegal. So this is a very, it's a very present issue, and if you can look up, maybe, or even invite them to talk to you, I think it would be very interesting. And as I said, they are UK based.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Trying to get rid of the nuclear weapons that we have across the world has been something that, obviously, like you say, started in the 60s, and we're still not really moving all that far on it. What do you think? Are there any sort of main roadblocks that you would suggest, or what do you think are kind of the steps that need to be taken to actually make that happen? Because it doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, these steps, they have already been discussed. So in the framework of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, every 5 years, there is a review conference. And so in the framework of this treaty, there are steps that have been already negotiated and agreed upon, towards the elimination of these weapons. So, for example, we're talking about the reduction of warheads, and we're talking about in the U.S. and in Russia, they together they have about 90% of all the deployed warheads in the world. So any progress that we will see in this field will need to come from these two countries. And then they need to sit down and start a conversation, or resume a conversation that they've had since the Cold War. But now it seems that the conversation is not going anywhere. They're actually withdrawing from treaties, from agreements that they've created to manage the situation many years ago. They're now just pulling out from these treaties. So and they're now talking about modernizing, creating new types of nuclear weapons. So this goes completely against the spirit of the treaty and the commitments that were made in a series of review conferences that we've had, since this treaty is in place. So the roadblock is not the roadblock, that's a roadblock, but the road is ahead.
Yeah.
But you have some roadblocks.
Yeah. I think that's another example as well of a complex issue that people don't spend a lot of time on. It's not just that certain countries have nuclear weapons, but it's, well, how many do they have? And how old are they? Because it's a recurring issue in this country, talking about putting money into the Trident project, and people don't realize that you can't just have nuclear weapons and they can't just sit there, right? They have to be maintained, they have to be updated, and there's all the costs associated with that. And again, complex issue that people don't take the time to think about.
Exactly. I mean, it's very expensive, and and then they're not there to be used because, as I said, it's a psychological effect. We're talking about deterrence, and that's a doctrine that has been around for many years, and since the end of World War II, people believe that the existence of nuclear weapons is maintaining the world the way it is, meaning that we don't have any major war, against superpowers because they refrain from fighting each other because of the weapons, of the existence of these weapons. So,
what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's dogma. That's not proved. That's not proved. That's dogma. I think that's just something it's a tautology is used to justify the existence of these weapons. So I think we can do much better than that, and we can get rid of these weapons and still, have our security assurances all in place. And also we should try to tackle the sources of discontentment between countries and try to fix them.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another question from the girls. So they say, what are you most proud of?
Oh, on a personal or on a professional level, let me think. On a professional level, I am very proud of being able to do my PhD. I think that was something very, very difficult, and it's still, I consider that to be a defining moment for me. It was a major achievement, so I'm very proud of that. Yeah. And I'm also proud of being able to use some of the skills I've received in my training as a physicist in the work I'm doing right now. I think that's very good. That's very unique. Well, on a personal level, I am very proud of my two kids. Nice. So I have a 5-year-old and 7-month-old.
Wow.
Just behind those doors.
Wow. Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much.
I do another question as well, actually. You talked about how certain things are illegal to use. If a country does use something that's illegal against another country, what happens? And what's the consequence?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because first of all, in international law, when we say that something is legal or something is not legal, we need to talk about for which countries these things are considered to be legal or illegal. So certain things are only considered to be under the international law and applicable for that country if there is a treaty or if there is like a consensus about this subject about all the countries, and that country in particular needs to be a signatory of that treaty or needs to have expressed its acquiescence with these premises. So, for example, to be very concrete, if there is a country that is not signatory of a convention to ban chemical weapons, and that country decides to use chemical weapons, one could argue that that treaty does not apply for that country because the country is not party of that treaty.
Ah, I see. Right.
Right? The law only gets to you if you are bound to a treaty.
Yeah,
and
sure.
and that's voluntary. It's voluntary. Nobody's forcing you to sign a treaty.
Yeah,
This doesn't happen. So that's why I say there's a lot of self-containment involved.
yeah,
You have to fulfill certain commitments. So
yeah,
you take the first step to go there and sign a treaty, and then you are saying to the world that you're going to abide by what is, on that piece of paper, and people need to trust. And then there is verification involved.
mm,
So for instance, the Chemical Weapons Convention comes with a very robust system for verifying the compliance with the treaty. So inspectors, they go to the countries and they look and see if the country is producing prohibited items, for example. And it's very interesting because it's very technical in nature. You go with these massive spectrographs, and you look at the chemical content of very small samples, and then you write down reports saying, okay, this country is in compliance, this country is not in compliance. But hang on a second, if you signed a treaty and you said you're going to be in compliance, and now you're trying to cheat the system, then you can sanction those countries, and then things, they can get really serious.
mm. Yeah,
Things can get very serious.
so just I don't know if the girls would know what does that mean? Like what sanctions can be put in place?
So, for example, at the United Nations Security Council level, the Security Council is basically the deciding body of the United Nations. They can come up with a list of sanctions to punish that country and try to make that country fall back to its commitments.
Hmm.
Right?
So I guess we could talk about like Syria and Assad here. There was, yeah,
I think in the case of Syria, Syria was not a signatory of the Chemical Weapons Convention.
I see. Yeah.
It wasn't at the time. And also, as far as I understand, there is a lot of controversy on the conclusions of these reports about the use of chemical weapons and who used it, because there is a question of attribution as well. Even if there is a field, even if there is a field mission going to a place and establishing, yes, there's been use of chemical weapons here, but who did that? That's also another question, and it's not trivial to come up with that conclusion. So, as far as I understand, there's a lot of controversy there. But yeah, I mean, in a typical scenario, that would be an example. Yeah.
I guess you could link this here as well into the talk about army robots and if an army robot were to do something like release a weapon like that, yeah, don't know how it got there, but maybe the robot found a chemical weapon and it just released it, and it's not my responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, you can get
It's
really
complicated.
creative.
Yeah.
You can get really creative and find funny combinations about these things. And yes, one can say that there are many legal gaps in the understanding and the applicability of some of these ideas, and someone not very well intentioned could exploit those gaps. And I didn't say, but there is also another dimension to this problem related to non-state actors, because I concentrated most of my discussion to what is done by countries, by states. But some of these things do not apply to terrorist organizations. They didn't sign any treaty. They don't even have any, they don't need to obey any law. So how do you treat them, And so that's also a very difficult problem. We live in a very complicated time. And I think the best we can do is really to educate ourselves and try to make an impact, a positive impact in the world the best way we can. And to choose wisely our leaders, because this matter a lot, not just domestically, but when these countries sit down together to decide things, this really affects the lives of many people when we're not even aware of it.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So if someone were interested in getting involved in diplomacy, say in the UK, what would you suggest they do?
Um, well, I would suggest looking up first the website of the foreign office, and look at the entry requirements there. I'm sure it's a little bit different than what we have here in Brazil, the way British diplomats are recruited. But it's definitely an option.
Mm,
Yeah.
great.
I don't know if there's any age limit. I don't know, minimal age or maximum age. I know that some foreign services, they require language skills, so it would be advantageous to speak at least another foreign language.
Mm. How many languages do you speak?
Right now, I speak Portuguese, my mother tongue, English, French, Spanish, and German.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.